Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicholas Harkness. I'm the Modern Korean Economy and Society Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Korea Institute. And with my colleague Jinah Kim from the Graduate School of Design, we welcome you back to the second day of this conference, Designers of Mountain and Water, Alternative Landscapes for a Changing Climate. We had a really exciting opening yesterday with a brilliant and inspiring presentation by Marissa Cheravanon on the Kaoyai Art Forest. And today we have a packed schedule of 4 different panels exploring this theme through different angles. I want to say, first of all, that we have live captioning available for our virtual and in-person audience. You'll see instructions and a QR code on the screen, and if you have any questions about the captioning, please either visit the AV booth if you're here, or send a message in the chat if you're not here, but here with us in spirit. Today, we're going to explore this theme through 4 different panels, the first of which, Cultures of Nature, I will describe momentarily. We'll move on to another panel this morning, The Work of Mountain and Water, which explores the profession and professional questions about landscape architecture across the various bioregions that we're discussing in this panel. After lunch, we'll move to the aesthetics of sustainability, looking more specifically at the question of climate change. And finally, we will wrap up with a question about the future and the concept of mountain and water and how it applies and extends in both time and space, followed by some closing remarks and discussion. The panel this morning is meant to simply open up the question about how human social groups come into contact with something we might call nature, and I think one of the things we'll be doing is holding the idea or concept of nature at some distance, not a stable concept. But the panelists this morning will be investigating this question largely through the history of the way different traditions and approaches to imagining, representing, and encountering nature have expressed themselves in art and other media. Our panel all come from Harvard University. They're all members of the faculty here, and I'll just take a moment to introduce them. Eugene Wang is the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Professor of Asian Art at Harvard University, where he holds the positions in art, the history of art and architecture, archaeology, the study of religion, theater, dance, and media, and Inner and Asia and Altaic studies. Quite a few things. His research also covers quite a few things, but in general, Asian Buddhist art as well as Chinese art history. And interestingly, he's the founding director of the Harvard CAM Lab, dedicated to turning cultural historical knowledge into sensorial experience. If you haven't visited it, I strongly suggest you do. We'll also be hearing from Jinah Kim, who is the George P. Bickford Professor of Indian and South Asian Art and Professor of South Asian Studies at Harvard University. In addition to her academic research and the numerous books that she's authored, she leads a digital humanities project on color and pigments in Asian painting called Mapping Color and History, which serves as an interdisciplinary research platform for conservation specialists, as well as really anyone interested in the material aspects of color. And recently, in her role as the Johnson Kouloukounis Faculty Director in the Arts at the Radcliffe Institute, she curated an exhibition on climate change, water stories, river goddesses, ancestral rites, and climate crisis, which was really exciting. Yukio Lippit will also be speaking on this panel. He's a professor of art, of the history of art and architecture here. He specializes in the history of Japanese art and has numerous books on topics such as painting of the realm, the Kano house of painters in the 17th century Japan, Japanese Zen Buddhism and the impossible painting, books on color, for example, Colorful Realm, Japanese bird and flower paintings, and Awakenings, Zen figure paintings in medieval Japan. And our final speaker today will be Professor Sun Joo Kim, who is the Harvard Yenching Professor of Korean History in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations here. She was for about a decade the director of the Korea Institute, my predecessor and my mentor. And her research focuses on the sociocultural history of the Choson Dynasty, resulting in publications on topics such as social movements, regional identity, kinship, genealogy, slavery, and legal history. And in relation specifically to the topic of this panel, she's collaborated with many colleagues in the field to offer a series of workshops in Korean art histories and the new frontiers in pre-modern Korean history workshop. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to our first speaker of the day, Professor Eugene Wang.
Well, I want to start with congratulations. Congratulations, Nick Jong-un, Sarah Whiting, and the Korean Institute, the GSD, and all the organizers for putting together this phenomenal event. It has been so hugely successful, inspiring, and forward-looking and timely. I want to begin with a seemingly banal question. What do mountains and waters add up to? The obvious answer is nature. The English word nature, if rendered in Chinese, is 自然. The term 自然 was already circulating around centuries before the Common Era. For a long time, however, it meant something quite different from what we assume today. It referred to spontaneity, letting things take their own courses without excessive human interventions. It had little to do with the mountains, rivers, and scenery. It was only in modern times that 自然 became equated with the physical nature and environmental surroundings. Meanwhile, there existed a long tradition of using the phrase mountains and water as a shorthand for the natural world and its pictorial or visual representations. Once nature and 自然 became aligned through modern translation, mountains and waters were folded into the equation. This easily led to an assumption that mountains and waters are simply about what is out there. That assumption, however, could be sometimes misleading. Landscape painting, commonly called mountains and waters, became a dominant pictorial genre in the 10th and 11th centuries in China. Well, actually, new archaeological discoveries may push that event even earlier, but that's a different story. When we read sources from that period, something striking emerges. Landscape was not primarily understood as scenery. It was understood as a system, very much like the human body. In fact, there was an explicit equation between natural order and bodily order. According to Guo Xi, who painted this work here, one of the leading landscape painters of the 11th century, mountains function as bone, as a skeletal system. Water corresponds to blood, to the circulatory system. At first glance, this may sound metaphorical, even poetic. But these ideas were actually taken quite literally. A medical illustration based on 12th century designs renders the human body explicitly as a landscape, peaks and valleys, channels and flows. This composition is far from being eccentric or casual. Placed alongside the contemporaneous landscape paintings, the resonance becomes unmistakable. In the medical illustration on the left, we see a wheel embedded within the body, an inner crucible gathering forces by conjugating water and fire, dragon, tiger, yin and yang. Energy generated internally then gets transported through vehicles known as a river cart, upward along the spine, completing a full cycle of circulation. Now look at the landscape painting to the right, to your right, a watermill with its turning wheel. To the left, travelers moving across bridge into the mountains. It may be futile to ask which composition design imitate which. More likely, both draw from a shared conceptual blueprint, nature and the body alike imagined as circulatory systems. This way of thinking about nature as flow, movement, and circulation, unfortunately, has largely receded from our view. Today, a lot of us, artists, curators, critics, and scholars, often fall back on or put in play a hardened opposition. Organic nature in the past versus artificiality in the present. Most of us probably are unaware that Chinese landscape tradition has always been deeply artificial, carefully constructed, formally inflected, and sometimes technologically driven. The binary between the organic and artificial, nature and design, tradition and modernity, may well be simply the wrong currency for nature, traditionally understood as circulatory systems. To make this point concrete, I want to turn to a single work, an architectural one since we're at GSD, that powerfully embodies this older East Asian blueprint of nature as circulation. I'm referring to Lu's Chapel at Donghai University, Taiwan, designed by people who had root right here. I'm Pei, C.K. Chen, and H.S. Feng, chiefly C.K. Chen, who was here. So it was completed in 1963. In 2014, the chapel was selected by the Getty Foundation's Keeping It Modern initiative as one of the 10 global modern architectural classics, alongside the Sydney Opera House, the Ruby House, and all the other great hits. It was the first modern Asian building to receive this recognition. The recognition is well-deserved. The Lu's Chapel was green before the green became the thing. It embodies flow before flow became a keyword, sustainability before sustainability became a discourse, pliance before folding entered architectural theory and practice in the 1990s. The chapel was initially conceived as a boat-like or tent-like structure, an architecture of movement rather than enclosure. It was first imagined in wood. C.K. Chen immediately thought the better of this, given Taiwan's heat, humidity, typhoons, and termites, and opted instead for reinforced concrete. This posed an enormous challenge. The design called for a column-free interior. A young German engineer initially involved in the project quit on the spot upon reviewing the plan. H.S. Feng did not. He employed a specific geometry, the conoid curve, allowing 4 twisted curved walls to lean into one another and lock in space. Here, shape itself became a strength. The building stands not because of columns, but because of curvature. It works like an eggshell, thin yet extraordinarily strong. Seen from outside, the chapel reads like a smooth eggshell. Step inside, however, it's waffles all over. The interior reveals a lattice of ribbed beams, thick and deep at the bottom where the load is greatest, gradually thinning as they rise. Near the top, they became astonishingly slender, some only about 8 centimeters wide. Now, this does 2 things at once. Structurally, it lowers the center of gravity, crucial for earthquakes. Visually, it creates a forced perspective, pulling the eye towards a narrow strip of glass running along the spine of the roof. That strip, the only one-line sky, literally split the building into two. The four curved walls never fully touch. They lean inward but remain slightly apart, bridged by the skylight. This allowed the structure to move if an earthquake hits, and if the sun hits the concrete and expands, the building has to give. It can breathe without cracking. This brings us to sustainability. In 1963 Taiwan, air conditioning was not standard, it was luxury, yet the chapel sits in a tropical climate. The solution was not machinery, but physics. The building operates through buoyant ventilation, the stack effect. Hot air rises and escapes near the roof, draws cooling air through the roof near the ground. The hotter it gets, the stronger the airflow. For roughly 30 years, the chapel cooled itself without a single fan. Even the exterior tiles participate. Each golden diamond tile has a raised bump, shading rainwater and protecting the concrete beneath. Equally significant is the chapel's placement. Rather than dominate the campus axis, it sits slightly aside, preserving sightlines to the mountains beyond. The building does not command the landscape, it enters into dialogue with it. The loose chapel thus becomes a masterclass in form finding, a sustained negotiation between geometry and gravity, form and force. It records an older understanding of nature, not something to be opposed, mastered, or insulated against, but something to be activated by letting designed forms and material properties do the work. And that brings us back to where we began. If nature and water once adapt to circulation rather than scenery, what should mountains and waters adapt to now in the way we design, build, and inhabit the world? Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I guess I will start also by congratulating Jung-Yoon and Nicholas for this timely and beautiful exhibition and this amazing conference. So thank you. And thank you for inviting me to congratulate, and thank you for inviting me to be part of it. So I'm an art historian of South and Southeast Asia, and one of my main research areas is that of, let's see, medieval Indic religious art and architecture. And when I say medieval Indic religions, I'm talking about the religious tradition that originate from the Indian subcontinent, namely Brahmanical or Hindu, and Buddhist and Jain traditions. And I teach a course titled, okay, if I can move it, Art of Monsoon Asia here, Interconnected History, which conceptualizes most parts of Asia as interconnected through a seasonal climate event of monsoon. And I believe this would actually more or less coincide with the bioregions that Jung-Yoon actually talked about yesterday, and also presented in the exhibition through rice cultivation. And these are some of the sites that we actually discuss in the course. And I have had the pleasure of having many GSC students take this course, and they actually make such impressive digital projects for the course. So if anyone is interested in this course, actually I'm offering it in the fall, so do sign up. It's a plug-in. And having grown up in Korea, I'm familiar with the concept of sansu, especially as expressed in the Syrian paintings of mountain and water that signal a humble and respectful attitude in human-nature relationship. Although one really finds something similar in medieval South and South Asia, paying attention to how nature is represented and embraced in art and architecture is a rewarding exercise. I'm particularly interested in exploring how water is represented and embraced because this analytical focus on water can help us understand the relationship between human and nature during the period when artwork was created or architecture was created and can give us insight into ecological and climate conditions of each period. I'm always in sort of awe of learning about ingenious approaches to harness nature, in this case water, to transform the man-made into the sacred and to manifest a mythological story in a physical, real, lived world. The story here is that of the most holy river in India, the Ganges River, or River Ganga, which used to be a celestial river, Milky Way in the skies, if you will. And the story goes, there was a severe drought on Earth. A sage named Bhagirat couldn't find any suitable water to do the last rite for his ancestors. You need the right kind of water to dissolve the ashes of the ancestors. He undertakes severe austerities and prays that the celestial river Ganga flow down to earth. And the goddess Ganga actually agrees, but she tells him that he needs to find someone to break her fall because she is, after all, a celestial river. If she just came down on earth, there's going to be a deluge and destruction. So then Bhagirat goes to the Hindu god Lord Shiva and does penance. I don't know if you can find him standing on one leg, and if you know yoga, like you will recognize his wonderful tree posture, right? And Shiva is impressed with Bhagirat's resolve that he agrees to intervene and let Ganga fall on the lock of his hair and trickle down onto earth. And in this incredible outdoor tableau sculpted in the 7th century on granite boulders overlooking the Bay of Bengal, at Mamallapuram in today's Tamil Nadu in India, the now unknown artists and designers represented the fall of Ganga not through her usual anthropomorphic form, which she does get represented as a goddess just coming down, but through the water that would collect during the monsoon and fall through that natural crack in between the carved boulders. By harnessing rainwater falling from the sky to represent this mythological origin story of the river Ganga, the makers of this tableau transformed this water into the sacred water, purifying and blessing the land of the Pallavas kings that laid far away from the actual river Ganga. Transforming the nature into the divine landscape was a lofty goal of the architects in ancient India. And one of the most impressive examples of this you will ever encounter is this 8th century monolithic rock cut temple at Kailasa at Ellora in today's Maharashtra, India. As the temple's known name Kailasa indicate, it is conceptualized as the divine abode of Lord Shiva, the mountain Kailasa high up in the Himalayas. And this is actually, you think this is a built architecture, but this is what's actually impressive about it. It's a monolithic rock cut architecture carved out of the surface of, this whole thing is a monolithic sculpture basically. Carved out of the existing rock formation from the top, its sheer monumental scale and complexity in design are just truly stupendous. And as a colossal rock cut monument, it is open to elements. So you can imagine how during the monsoon, the rainwater falling on this Shiva's Himalayan home activate the origin story of the Ganga, which in fact captures, if you think about that story and actually think about the topographic features of the Indian subcontinent, this story actually captures the topographic features of the Indian subcontinent in the cosmic and transcendental scale. The Ganga Brahmaputra River tributaries originates from the Himalayas. So does the Indus River, comes from the Himalayas, and breaking down the torrential fall of the celestial river so they become tiny streams will fall through like Shiva's lock of hair, like the streams of coming down from the Himalayas. So there is sort of the transposition and transformation of this story here. And this imagining of the human environment of mountain and water in the cosmic and transcendental scale is a driving design principle for temple building in medieval South and South Asia, as this Kailasa temple is also understood as Dakshina Meru, or the cosmic mountain, Mountain Meru in the south. Mount Meru is in the center of the universe in the Indic cosmology, and it is literally transposed or transferred onto the land of Rashtrakutas, the kings that built this monument. And they literally moved the mountain to their territory on the backs of lions, elephants, and vialas, or these mythical leonine creatures. So with that, I mean, I hope if you've never been to this place, I hope you will put Kailasa Temple at Ellora on your bucket list. This is really a place to visit. The pictures don't do justice. You know, there's just stupendous scale. The sheer scale is just mind-boggling. Anyways, so let me end this short presentation with what I think is the most impressive man-made monument that embraces the idea of mountain and water in cosmic scale, the Angkor Wat in Cambodia. This is an early 12th century monument built by Khmer King Suryavarman II, originally dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. Right? And Vishnu appears in one of the corridors of Angkor Wat, here happily churning the ocean, cosmic ocean that always begins a new cycle of time. And the scale is again stupendous, even more colossal than the Kailasa Temple at Ellora. It sits on a site measuring 162 hectares or 402 acres. I have no sense of how big this is actually in actual numbers, but I'm sure actually you guys actually understand these numbers better than I do. With an outer wall of 3.6 kilometers or 2.2 miles long, with 300-meter paved causeway linking the entrance gateway to the main temple complex. And to think this is all man-made is in the tropical jungle is like amazing. It's like mind-boggling. The Mount Meru in the center of cosmic ocean is precisely the image that the architects and the designers had in mind when building this monument. The central complex with 5 peak towers, we call the 5 peaks of Mount Meru. And most importantly, this man-made moat that surrounds the main temple invokes the cosmic ocean, in the middle of which rises this cosmic mountain, here, the main temple. They even marked the causeway connecting the entrance to the main temple with a Naga balustrade. Nagas are mythical serpentine beings that control water, in this case imagined as a bridge between the human realm and the divine cosmic realm. But this water surrounding the temple is not just symbolic, actually. Recent studies suggest that this body of water plays an important function of being a counterweight, literally lifting this mountain temple up, preventing it from sinking into the ground from its own weight. The ingenuity in design and engineering makes it hard to believe that this was achieved in the tropical bioregion of Cambodia, near the Mekong Delta, in the early 12th century. Guess what they call this like architect, or the so-called architect of this Angkor Wat? The later traditions started calling him Vishvakarman, the divine architect. And in a way, I think designers of mountain and water have superpowers, as you actually see outside this room in the galleries. So I hope these historical examples can serve as useful references, imagining new innovative ways for designing landscape and building for the sustainable future. So thank you.
What a privilege to speak at this conference. I'd also like to convey heartfelt gratitude to Jung-Yoon, Nick, Sarah, all the organizers for this wonderful occasion and opportunity. I'm also an art historian who attempts to study and teach, among other things, the history of East Asian landscape painting of the kind that you see on the screen here, mostly in PA 47, but occasionally in PA 48 and PA 50 as well. So today, in my brief time at the podium, from the perspective of an art historian, I wanted to make a few observations about landscape paintings in East Asia. Hopefully they'll resonate with some of the themes of this dynamic gathering and exhibition. I'm doing so with an awareness that the term landscape itself is problematic term for the paintings you see here. No landscape architect needs to be told this, but it's actually better captured by the conference's title, Images of Mountains and Water. I'll simply use landscape here for the sake of convenience. Okay, the first observation is that East Asian landscape painting is fundamentally intersubjective. It's probably the case that our general notion of a landscape painting was formed in the 19th century West, and this genre implies a strong sense of a subjective view of nature, as captured by Friedrich's famous painting. Not only is this a scene of a stormy seascape, but it's of an individual viewing that seascape, a scene of nature, and it makes us reflect upon that act of human subjective perception itself. So in this regard, the painting is highly solipsistic, very meta. Landscape, in this instance, internalizes a human perceiving subject as its starting point. So what you see here is a dramatic example of a sublime landscape, but one could say the same for other examples of landscapes associated with manifest destiny, the picturesque, and so forth. In traditional East Asian landscape painting, and I'm showing you here what Professor Wang showed earlier, the perceiving human subject is never so centered. Landscapes are not so much representations of nature out there to be observed and perceived as manifestations of a governing principle of the world. And this is what Eugene discusses in relation to the correlative human body as well. I have a slightly different way of explaining this according to classical Chinese metaphysics, but without getting too pedantic about it, it really manifests this idea of a world without a creator, a monistic universe that privileges unity and connectedness, governed by the Tao, made up of qi or vital energy, the basic stuff of the world used to explain all kinds of dynamic processes, from the formation of heaven and earth to patterns of weather to processes of the human heart, closely connected with life and the generative power of nature. The landscape has its own subjectivity. This can be experienced visually in early spring, and you might say the landscape manifests the way as natural generation and regeneration without cessation. And in doing so, it transposes to painting a compositional principle sometimes known as the S-curve, in essence a graphic symbol of the creative principle of the world that's later reified, of course, into the yin-yang symbol. Where then does this leave the viewer? Well, the viewer also participates in this flux and change. The viewer's role is to wander through the landscape with self-soness, tsuran, and let the landscape happen to them. Landscape has a kind of hive mind. We look at it, but it also looks at us. In this regard, the landscape is fundamentally intersubjective. A very different example of intersubjectivity can be found in splashed ink landscape, painted in 1495 by the Japanese monk painter Sesshu. This is an example of a landscape in the splashed ink mode, which is said to have originated in a very performative manner. According to an 8th century Chinese account, a painter by the name of Wang was known to throw ink-soaked rags against the wall while intoxicated. Now, from the ink-stained mark that resulted, he would then elaborate with his brush a landscape. In later centuries, paintings in the splashed ink tradition were often carefully designed and painted, but were based upon the conceit that they originated from accidental or arbitrary ink stains, and took pains to convey a sense of accidentalism in the final image. I think you can see that here. But an important component of this mode of painting is that the viewer is meant to complete the image. As with Sesshu's painting, the painter only does so much to suggest the features of mountains, trees, and waterfronts, just enough to activate the viewer's imagination and allow the beholder to consummate the image in their mind. In medieval Japan, this tradition was embraced by Zen monk painters like Sesshu, and one might say that splashed ink landscapes served well the Zen concept of the non-self, of the idea that the individual self was an illusion and that one was always porous to the minds and selves of others. So this is yet another example of how an East Asian landscape can be, in various ways, group-authored or intersubjective. My second observation is that ink painting is both a pigment and a medium that is pitch perfect for capturing mountain water pictures in East Asia. It is a remarkable medium whose qualities enable one ink painted stroke, just one stroke, to conjure an entire universe and position us in a new relationship to the world. Take, for example, this painting. It's a very simple 13th century scroll of a pair of sparrows perched on bamboo. But if you take a close look at a detail of any one of the bamboo leaves you see on the right here, you see that a single stroke immediately conjures the body of the brush wielder. It's a brush stroke. It's the result of a gestural act, but it also renders a motif in nature, the bamboo leaf. But it also depicts the atmospheric conditions around the leaf, the air, the mist, the moisture, possibly even light. And by revealing the scratchy traces of brush hairs and trailing off into the ether, it renders the leaf amidst the flux of the world. Thus, this single stroke connects the body of the painter to nature, and even the cosmos, and even the vital energy flowing through the cosmos. This is all the result of one stroke. Now, historically speaking, the potential of ink painting to depict the thing in the world in this manner advances dramatically in the 8th century with the increased use of wash effects among Tang Dynasty painters, especially with the emergence of ink landscapes. And in part, this is owed to the larger role accorded to water and the different saturations of ink that water produces that can coexist within a single painting. So early spring, which we return to here, is really one culmination of this trend. And it's no accident that the common term for ink painting today in East Asia is actually water ink painting. In Korean, sumokwa, in Chinese, shuimohua, in Japanese, suibokuga. Ink itself actually consists of some form of graphite or carbon, an earthy mineral or tree soot mixed with water. So one can say that the material of ink itself, made of mountains and water, is perfectly suited for the rendering of mountains and water, for this imbrication of all things in nature in everything else in East Asian landscapes. So East Asian landscapes are scenes of water and land and individual motifs in nature connected in a matrix through the magic of ink painting. But what should we call this imbrication of everything and everything else, at least in paintings? Well, the best eco-critical thought offers some promising ways of approaching this question and leads me to my third and final observation. East Asian landscapes depict what figures like the philosopher Timothy Morton call hyper-objects. Objects, subjects, or motifs of cultural representation that have traditionally not been thought of as such, as motifs, or even rendered visible in the more mimetic traditions of, say, European academic painting. A good example of a hyperobject is wind, which is simply too large and omnipresent to be a thing that can be depicted. A hyperobject could also be mist or weather or luminescence or something else. It's everywhere in the world and everywhere in art, but we sometimes miss it because art is usually described in terms of things. Take, for example, what is now one of the most famous images in global visual culture, Hokusai's Great Wave, circa 1830. It's not an ink landscape, but it nevertheless serves our purposes here because it raises important questions about landscapes and the hyperobject. For example, what is the subject matter of this image? Well, in the 19th century, Japanese commentators in France considered it to be the wave. And indeed, La Vague was the name given to it by Edmond de Goncourt, who authored the first monograph on Hokusai in 1896. And in his description of the picture, Goncourt evokes the aesthetics of the sublime and was probably thinking of contemporary paintings by French artists such as Gustave Courbet on the right here, which portrays the awesome power of nature through stormy seascapes and giant waves. And Claude Debussy's orchestral work, La Mer, was famously inspired by Hokusai's print, and which graces the cover of his score. More historically informed viewers might counter this by arguing that the subject of Hokusai's print is not the wave, but the mountain beyond, Mount Fuji, the most famous peak in the archipelago. It has the highest elevation in the Japanese islands, was worshipped as a deity since the prehistoric era, and was extolled for centuries in prose and poetry. Hokusai designed a series about the mountain, 36 views of Mount Fuji. It was so popular and ended up numbering 46 prints total. This series portrays the mountain from different regions in Japan during different seasons, times of day, in relation to different kinds of human activity. The Great Wave is one of these variations, and it shows the mountain from the vantage point of Suruga Bay in the early morning with fishermen. But here we return to my observation. And I would argue that the subject of the Great Wave is not the wave, but neither is it Mount Fuji. whatever the title of the series implies. Rather, it's something like the relationship between the two. One of the great characteristics of the prints of the 36 views of Mount Fuji is that with each print, Fuji changes its appearance in relation to its surroundings, different regions, and so forth. So if you look carefully here, you can see that Fuji shapeshifts. It morphs into a different texture and color, even a different outline. If you look at the print here, the silhouette of the mountain here is very kind of prickly and jazzy and staccato-like, basically mimicking the texture of the enormous bark of the tree which is coupled with it. Or in this work here, in which the wispy linear outline of the mountain that you see up at the top here resembles the pieces of rope by which the fisherman controls the cormorant birds that are fishing for him beneath the waters. The Great Wave showcases this idea as well. The slopes of the mountain mimic the parabolic curvature of the ocean waves to the point where it might be mistaken for a diminutive wave itself, almost lost in the seascape. And its white peak resembles the white crests of the wave. In fact, the ocean spray you can see in the middle here provides the pretext for a visual pun, as it can be playfully read as snow falling softly on the peak of Mount Fuji. So this twinning of Mount Fuji and its surroundings in this series is what I'd like to call a hyperobject. It is invisible in parts. It's a form of mutualism or sympathetic resonance, a mysterious quality of communion or in-betweenness. And like much of traditional East Asian landscape, it's about unspoken reciprocity, the magical exchange and in-betweenness of things in the world. Thank you.
You gave me 40 seconds, or over 40 seconds, I do not know. But anyway, I also like to offer warm congratulations to Jung-Yoon and Nick for making this amazing exhibition and symposium happen. And I feel really honored to be part of this. I was invited to give a talk on Korea, quite late, but hopefully I can offer some historian's point of view. So in Korean history, sansu, mountain and water, looms large in politics, society, culture, and people's everyday life, as more than 70% of its land is mountainous, and annual precipitation is plentiful, especially during its early summer rainy season. From early on in history, people have believed that their natural environment determines their life, while also being able to alter the landscape to improve it. This human involvement in altering nature has deep historical roots and complex political implications, I would argue. I like to explore Korea's own natural conditions and their own ways of dealing with sansu, or nature, by examining how Seoul became the capital of the Joseon dynasty and how the royal court managed positive and negative natural elements inherent in the site of its capital. In 1392, a new dynasty called Joseon was born. The founders of the new kingdom desired to have a new capital, moving away from Kaesong, the capital of the previous dynasty, and thus power base of old elites. Of several candidates, they chose Hanyang, present-day Seoul, in 1394, because the place has been famous for its superb mountains and water for ages. It is also centrally located, making convenient for water and land transportation. And making this the dynasty capital is in accordance with the will of heaven and the people. Here, when the officials mentioned the place's superb sansu, they were referencing to its superior geomantic merits. Originated in ancient China, geomancy is human beings' response to forces working within nature. It teaches that yin and yang forces interact in their creativity in nature, and they fill the earth and circulate under its surface like blood running through a human body. Eugene just mentioned a little bit about that. The key geomantic technique is to find auspicious sites for a building, town, or a tomb by investigating the configuration of the earth. Just as damage to a blood vessel results in sickness, so the ill treatment of certain vital spots on the surface of the earth disturb the subterranean forces, which can in turn disrupt the harmony of human society. Conversely, the construction of a temple, palace, house, or town on an auspicious site is believed to revitalize the subterranean forces and prolong the prosperity of dynasty, people, and town. Geomancy held sway over the entire traditional history of Korea. Although some rational-minded officials and scholars were critical of geomancy for being superstitious and misleading people, it became one of the crucial factors in selecting the new capital. The overall configuration of Hanyang or Seoul fits the shape of the geometrically auspicious site, surrounded and protected by Baekaksan as main mountain, Naksan to the east, Inwangsan to the west, and Namsan to the south. Bukhansan to the north, and Kwanaksan to the further south across the Han River were additional features that made the site perfect. Water features in geomancy were also critical. The Gaechon, now called Cheonggyecheon, is considered inner water, while the Han River regarded as outer water. However, geomancers had at least two concerns about the site of the Gyeongbok Palace, the primary palace of the new dynasty in Seoul. First was the rocky mountains surrounding the site, like Inwangsan to the west, as you see in this famous 18th century painting by Chung Sun, whose other paintings are featured in the digital installation at the gallery. This present-day photo of Baekaksan to the north of the palace also shows its rocky nature. Second concern was lack of water features. Thankfully, geomantic theory provides solutions when an auspicious site lacks perfection. Rocky mountains could be screened by planting trees. Digging a pond or a stream corrects the lack of water. And that's exactly what early kings did over time. For example, King Sejong in 1433 ordered to plant trees and dig ditches in Gyeongbok Palace to offset the geometric flaws. Human intervention in nature during the Joseon was not only to reshape geometric elements, but for practical reasons as well, to make the place worthy of a dynastic center. One of the major public works that the court initiated and constantly managed throughout the dynasty concerns water. Numerous natural creeks flowing down from surrounding mountains, you see here in blue lines, joined the Gaechon at the lowest part of Seoul and flowing to east before meeting the Han River. These creeks, as well as Gaechon, flooded often, especially during the rainy season, as rainwater rushed down from rocky mountains, causing destruction and death. The project to control water began early in the dynasty by digging ditches and banking them with stones. The first major project took place in 1412. It took 1 month and the labor of 52,800 adult men. It involved the areas from the Gyeongbok Palace to the 5 sluice gates to the east, The project involved opening waterways or digging ditches, as well as fortifying the banks with stone and lumber, and building stone bridges, such as Supyo Bridge you see in the background of this image from the early 20th century. After all, taming water was one of the indicators of a good government. The court, therefore, monitored and maintained the Gaechon and other smaller creeks, which functioned as carrying away dirty urban waste from the palaces, offices, and ordinary households in Seoul, which supported about 100,000 people in the early Joseon period. By the mid-18th century, Seoul population was twice bigger than early Joseon. More population meant deforestation of nearby mountains, causing more silt flowing into Gaechon and elevating the floor, resulting in frequent flooding. In 1760, King Yeongjo, who professed to be a sage ruler, mobilized about 200,000 men for 2 months to dredge the stream. This painting celebrates King Yeongjo's personal observation of the dredging work at the 5 Sluice Gate. After completing the work, the king ordered to engrave the 4 letters Gyeongjin Jipyeong, meaning the floor level of 1760, at the foundation stone of one of the bridges to mark the standard or desirable floor level. This floor level was to target at least 2 major dredging works in 1833 and 1886. We know better about the fate of the Gaechon, now called Cheonggyecheon, in the 20th century. After the Korean War, the area along the Cheonggyecheon became a slum as many war refugees huddled and built unlicensed sheds to live. It was also unhygienic and foul as all untreated sewage flowed into the stream. The government adopted the strategy of covering the stream with concrete between 1955 and 77, and also constructed overpass above between 1967 and 71. The entire project was regarded as one of the successful symbols of Korea's modernization and industrialization under the authoritarian government. Soon, however, people began to think the Cheonggyecheon area as most crowded, noisy, and ugly, as the area served many wholesale and retail shops, workshops, and sweatshops. As the water underneath the concrete pavement turned into a toxic sludge. The deconstruction of the area, removing the concrete cover over the stream and overpass, began in 2003. And the stream itself has been reborn as an artificially running stream with the help of modern technology, yet inviting both nature and human back to the area. The superb sansu of Seoul, with some modifications on it, allowed the human being to prosper for many centuries. As civilization evolves, we exhaust and we even damage its natural resources while introducing artificial touches to maximize its visible and invisible merits and minimize its weaknesses. Many of these public works also sprang with certain political agendas. To keep Seoul or Korea more sustainable, what more should we do or not do? Thank you.
And now I'm going to invite our panelists to the front for a bit of time for discussion. Before we open it to the audience, you can choose your own seat. I think probably, like most of you in the audience, I would, in some ways, just to prefer to have longer presentations, so I could just continue to learn more from each of you about these illuminating ideas and the depth of your specialization. So I only have one general question to ask, and then I hope that each of you might pose some questions as well, since you all are working in similar fields. I mean, I throughout most of this, I have been a parasite and observer and student of disciplines that I'm quite far from, and in this case too, I feel like I've learned so much. So my central question that I'd just love to hear elaboration from all of you on before we open it up to broader discussion is where you see the threshold between something like imagination and representation and intervention. That is, the last example that Sun Joo gave was of a really massive projects of intervention in relation to representing and kind of cosmologically ordering the world. And each of you gave somewhat different views of this depending on the kind of material you presented. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that threshold, and if that's even the right place to begin, or if there's a better place to begin around the question of sansu and nature and landscape and design and so on and so forth. Who would like to start? Anyone? Great. Let's go in order. Wonderful.
Well, actually, we could pinpoint historically the threshold to be in 9th century with the intellectual kind of godfather of landscape named Han Yu. And he, I think, laid out some kind of cultural genes that predisposed the subsequent thinking about what mountain and water is about. And it was Han Yu that inspired the Song rise of landscape. So if we were to try to figure out what Han Yu was all about, well, he essentially draw on Buddhist resources about how syntactically you think about the object. And then he goes into the mountain, and he starts to write about his experience of going to the mountain. And that's where mountain become totally deconstructed. Mountain became not a thing out there. Mountain become a succession of facets and aspects. And so he would run this syntax like or, meaning that mountain is A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So that liberty with which he took to deconstruct mountain and dissolve sort of human experience of mountain as a set of impressions and projections and understandings. And I think that's essentially what predisposed the later formation of landscape tradition, in which you do not treat a landscape as this physical thing out there, but it's a some kind of human projection, understanding, interpretation, and so on and so forth. And that leads all the way back to now, where architects and artists and they create what is I think to borrow from Ramhula's, it's some kind of hyper nature, in the sense that it is really a sort of overlaying of these facets and assemblages and so on. So therefore, I think everything to me kind of started in that threshold in the 9th century, when this kind of laid, the stage is set, the ground is laid, and then we are all somehow indebted to that moment.
Well, and I can't find like a 9th century moment in South and Southeast Asia, but thinking about how Angkor Wat is constructed, and I think that's an interesting question, Nick, about sort of where does representations or symbolic interpretation versus intervention, like where does it like intersect, or what's, and I don't think it's like one thing ends and the other thing begins. It really is sort of interconnected, at least in the case of Angkor, where to have that much water actually surround the temple, there is a whole elaborate sort of water channels that they build throughout at least 2 centuries that they work on actually building water channels. And the water management system in ancient Cambodia is just remarkable, actually. And so that is definitely, interventions, but harnessing the nature in a way that will benefit the cosmos, that it's not only the human world. So there is a level to which that is intervention that's also kind of trying to realize more meaning than just like practical. There's a very practical solution of actually making sure that water can flow from the mountain to the plain, in this case, and get the water actually surround the temple to actually hold the temple up, which was kind of really mind-boggling, actually. But then that symbolism is sort of happens partly because they do all these interventions. So human interventions are not separate from this symbolic and interpretation and force that actually, how else are you going to convince people to work on these like massive projects unless that you are really convinced of its divine nature in a way? Like if you think about like 11th, 12th century Cambodia, in the tropical, I don't know bioregion number, but I will try to find it, that to imagine that people actually, what? I am 12. Okay, so in I am 12 to actually work, and they're not. It's not like they have a fork lane or the whatever like modern equipment. So we're talking about human labor that is actually making this possible. And I think that divine sort of meaning, the symbolic meaning, the cosmic meaning was so powerful that actually made the intervention possible in a way. So it goes both ways, I think.
I always defer to Sun Joo here, but this is a really rich question, and I guess I would say that for me, art as cultural representations provide insights into what a bioregion is and how it's been imagined in the past by different communities and different historical eras, and how that might inform the present and our own work. And what's interesting about that is that landscape painting, pictures of mountain and water, are representations of kind of bounded natural worlds that are to some extent self-contained. And what's interesting about East Asian landscape, when you look at its history, is that mountains are not inside bioregions, but they're kind of for me, they're the borders of bioregions. They're where you set the boundaries. It's kind of like geological plates, right? What is a mountain? It's where 2 geological plates are butting up against each other and they're welling up. That's what a volcano is. A volcano is a boundary marker. So, the volcanic ring of fire idea is very operative here. So Hokusai's Fuji series posits the mountain as this distant boundary, as the end point of an imagined unit of the natural world within which human activity takes place, society settles. It's like humans settling in basins, and they're surrounded by mountains. And there's some kind of deep meaning to the way in which traditional landscape paintings create this boundary world of mountains and water. But so actually I would ask you, Jung-Yoon, with the bioregions, because the bioregions in the large map that you've created some of them conform to nation states. So they're not, Korea, Japan, elsewhere, but I was wondering if there are other ways of conceiving them, slicing across in a more textured way some of these mountainous terrains within the countries. So I'll stop there. It's like Confucius answering a question with another question. It's a really bad habit.
So I don't know what to say, but as a historian, when I look at sources and how things historically evolved, I think the shapes of mountains and waters and how they're related to the lives of people, it's very closely intertwined, and I think people from very early on realized that very intimate link between nature and people. And in a way, as the state began to emerge, it's also closely linked to royal authority and symbolism. So one of the things I sort of remembered when Jinah presented her work is that Cambodia, the huge complex surrounded by square moat, and there is one castaway, the road linking the temple, is a temple? Temple and outside the world, right? Across that moat. Not that big scale, but in Korea, all these palaces, as far as I know, those that are remaining in Seoul, they are surrounded by small moats or streams. It's not stagnant water. I think it's a constantly moving water originally. And the photo I showed you is the one I shoot from the bridge, going over that stream from outside the palace, getting into the palace main gate. So that's the bridge dividing, I guess, royal and non-royal. And you see similar configuration when you enter major temples, Buddhist temples in Korea. So you see the use of water to carry away, dirty stuff from the palaces, and also cooling effect during summer, but also it demarcates authority bearing royal, household inside the palace and non sort of ordinary people's living outside the palace. So I think this close link between nature and human, symbolism, authority, all closely related and represented in very visible way.
I think then this leads me to at least one more question. And this is inspired in part by observing the workshop yesterday where I saw, world-famous practitioners working with students aspiring to great professions. And one of the key themes that people were returning to is what people learn from their mistakes. Like, well, we tried this and it didn't work, and we tried this and then the soil was too permeable, or we figured out that the permeability of the soil was spread farther than we knew. These kinds of questions, right? Which then is part of what teaching is. So there's a very practical dimension to that learning. And I think as we move into the next panel on the work of Mountain and Water, I'd maybe pose the question slightly differently. And I'll start this way. So my way into much of this material, like I was explaining yesterday, is through the things that I know, which have been quite far from things like landscape, mountain, and water. But one of the things we learn when the modern object of language is formulated is that it far exceeds our ability as individuals or even groups to control it. It's a hyper-object in that sense. It's distributed across populations, and we try to manipulate one piece of it, and we think we've got it, but what happens is it fills in just like water, and things start to shift around, and the structure of system far exceeds us, the same with culture. It's very difficult to change these things, because they operate by their own logics, and they exceed the ability of any individual or small group to control them. So, to put it in the negative, do you have examples from this research or from your thinking about these materials where people failed and learned and came through either by reinforcing certain ways of approaching the question of nature or that threshold between a subject and an intersubjective kind of world, or perhaps even very technical innovations that came out of failure that you think might be helpful in this context?
I'll give you an example. I mean, so the first tableau that I showed of the granite boulder, the fantastic granite boulder that's carved outdoors, that tableau of the Descent of Ganges story, that actually they started carving one, like another corner about like 400 meters or 300 meters away, and started carving that relief, and then realized it's not sustainable, that the rock was not quite right for this kind of carving. So there is a half-done piece that's like basically around the corner. And they ditched that and decided to use this other boulder. And I think that boulder site, they realized is actually better situated to really make meaning come out, that it's really looking over the Bay of Bengal, and it actually has a natural cleft in between. And they learned that that's how they can actually make more stories come alive, because the initial sighting would have allowed only a small portion of that story, whereas this particular sighting that they realized the rock's better, and then they can actually sort of really creatively embrace the natural elements better. So there are examples, and I think the Angkor Wat itself, that having that moat to really press the balance weight, I think it comes from the experience of earlier. So Cambodian, the Khmer Empire, as it develops, every king builds a mountain temple. So they have been building mountain temple, but I think the site of Angkor Wat is slightly outside the main activity area, and I think it's probably was more swampy actually. So they needed something more solid, and I think it's from those experiences of building mountain temples over time, because that they actually realized they needed a counterweight for this to sustain, otherwise it will actually sink. So that is one thing, I think, not only symbolic, but very functional, that probably developed over time. So that's very concrete examples that I can give you.
I have an old case that actually speaks to this question, which is, well, speaking of the hyperobject. So the hyperobject that exemplify and to some extent speak to this question is this kind of Neolithic drum made of alligator's skin. So the idea starting off with that is you make alligator skin as a drum, and you beat it for the ritual occasions. Well, this goes back to Neolithic times. And the starting premise, of course, is you tune in with nature, because alligators is about how you sense the early stirrings of spring. And then once that stirring starts, you should organize everything, human activities and so on, along that man-nature synergy and harmony. So in theory, that is total respect of nature. But what happened was that in the end, somehow alligator pushed more. We're starting in the Yellow River region. There's a lot of alligators in the northern, and over centuries and millennia, you have the alligator pushed more and more to the south. So human activities in the end, starting off seemingly theoretically, conceptually, seem to tune in to that kind of man-nature harmony, somehow ended up producing the opposite effect. So that's a huge historical lesson that we need to think about how that happened. Yeah.
Well, so the Kechon or Cheonggyecheon story, that dredging work, which took place, I guess, repeatedly throughout Joseon period, it gives an example of not so much of mistake, but I guess negotiation and compromise amongst the king officials and people who provided labor for that work. So I showed you a modern picture, a photo of the early 20th century showing Supyo Bridge in the background, but you saw also there's a little shop, on the, not even bank, it's almost at the bottom of the Cheonggyecheon, showing at the time already the floor of the stream is quite high, right? So when King Yeongjo initiated that dredging work in 1760, after works almost done, he convened his officials and asked them, so what do you think of this whole, project? And of course, he's already quite old by the time. He's longest reigning king in Joseon dynasty. And I guess he expected all kind of praises by his officials. It's a great job and, amazing and so on. And people now can live without worrying about flood and so on. But one official stood up and said, this is incomplete work because all the earth dug up from the stream, silt, mostly sand-like. So they put those sandy soil right by the stream, and it created 2 or 3 huge artificial mountains, right? But it was almost right by the stream. So to this official, this is nonsense. Over time, those sand will collapse and flow down back to the stream, within a few decades or so. So to do more thorough job, we need to mobilize more people to move all this sand outside the gate, outside the wall of Seoul, far away from the Cheonggyecheon waterways. Well, the record says King was unhappy to hear that. I think for King Yeongjo and the court, already they mobilized 200,000 people to do this, and the court spent tons of gold and silver accumulated, stored grain to feed the laborers and so on, and mobilizing another 100,000 people to do this job. Probably he expected some sort of a revolt amongst these people living in and nearby Seoul. So King Yeongjo didn't do this. So I think this artificial mountain existed for a while, and the next kings who did the same dredging work, pile up the sand right next to the stream, and I've heard that these artificial mountains still were visible in the 20th century. It's not there now. It's not there with urban development and so on. So it's partially mistake and failure when you look at the work in a long-term perspective, but there is also so much you can do without provoking problems, right?
I had to chuckle when I heard the question, Nick, because from my view, and building on what Sun Joo said, the history of city planning based on traditional geomantic principles is nothing but a history of mistakes and disasters. And there's never been a successful example of that. I mean, what is a successful city, right? But especially with this genre, it has left to nothing but disasters. And it's really interesting in light of this idea in the present that, feng shui has some kind of wisdom embedded in it, because for me, it's just a set of really onerous principles that have had to be overcome, and, many, many lives destroyed and mobilized in order to overcome in the history of East Asia. If you know the history of Kyoto, you know that as soon as it was set up, like basically the entire west side of the city was flooded, and it kind of drifts over immediately. And before that, they tried to make this capital Nagaoka, which was like a 10-year experiment in absolute disaster, where it flooded before they started building it, basically. And so it's just really fascinating how ideology congeals and kind of gains momentum and works over and over. So we have these remarkable cities today, despite Chinese imperial city planning.
So I think that we end on, we end this conversation on the right note. That's exactly where I wanted to land. Okay, wonderful. So we have about 7 minutes and 50 seconds, 49 seconds, 48 seconds, 47 seconds. I'm watching the clock. We have about 7 minutes to open it up for any questions from the audience that you might like to ask. Yeah, Gary Hildebrand. Susan Lawrence is coming with the microphone for you.
Thank you all for really a great start to the day. I think this panel would be a great intervention in one of our theory courses. Really, because it's very stirring, the instability of our way of thinking of nature, right? The unstable term, as Nicholas said. You all teach, I presume, in FAS, undergraduates and, of course, graduate students. You have PhDs, many from Asia, I'm sure. Last night, I was really struck by the idea that a young girl growing up in a household with educated parents understood sansu because of what was in the foyer of her home, and maybe because of the kind of education she would get inside the home and at school. And I asked Kunmarisa, do you think young people today know this, understand that the world is construed of mountain and water? You've all talked about it, and you come into contact with young people. I would like to ask you the same question. Do your students come with knowledge of this? Or when they acquire it, when you share it, does it become meaningful in their lives?
Actually, Gary, that's an excellent question. And I do have this very close-range personal kind of experience interacting with undergraduate. There's one remarkable Harvard undergraduate that kind of have been seeing through since her freshman years. And she somehow had this environmental consciousness kind of baked into her after she came into Harvard. And then she came from a relatively well-to-do family, but somehow she took upon herself to actually get her embedded in some internship program and went to Africa and sent me the picture of her in front of a line, deadline with other African people and so forth. So she's been doing all that, and she also consciously choose the kind of fields that allow her to pursue this kind of interest and her passion for ecology and so forth. So I had this really personal, conversation with her and say, wow, this is really remarkable. I mean, I've been watching you developing over, she's now senior now. So is your interest kind of widely shared? She said, well, actually, tell you the truth, I don't get that sense. She might be an outlier, she said. Other people seem to be more driven by the anxiety about career, how to become, financial consultant and all these other things. So that's kind of shook me. And I just thought, well, it's both encouraging seeing her development, but also somehow unsettling that she was sharing with her take on this larger landscape of our education. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the Art of Monsoon Asia course, I think the people who show up for that course already kind of has that awareness, but still, I think, every class, every site, every place that I share and talk about, it's completely changing their ways of thinking about nature and human relationship, I guess, and I'm hoping. And I don't think they're coming in with that kind of acute awareness that Marisa was talking about. But they're open to it, and I think I'm trying to say there is a hope. If they can come into these classrooms, and what we do, I think, is to open their minds to see and come to see exhibitions like this. I think that's actually, a great way to, that's why we do what we do, educate people to see things differently. And hopefully, even if they don't have that kind of acute awareness, we can cultivate them at that point in time, I hope.
And just to tack on to what Jinah said, it's such a challenging question to respond to, because I think there are real contradictions in the way student age populations relate to the natural world. On the other hand, I would say, no, they don't share Marsa's consciousness. Absolutely not. You've never seen a group of people more alienated from the natural world, in the sense that it's not just because they live in cities or anything, but they're part of a system that is driving them to pursue singularly certain ways of achieving and accrediting themselves. And but on the other hand, there's this remarkable and inspiring consciousness and anxiety about that alienation and the world's increasing alienation. And that's really inspiring. And you've never seen so much interest in fields like environmental science and eco-criticism and all these other things among very young people doing very sophisticated things in these fields and wanting to change the world. So it's that kind of coexistence of these two states of being. So I
think you're doing the Lord's work.
Just to add a little bit of anecdote here, when I give a lecture on economic history of Joseon Dynasty, I try to explain how agricultural method changed in that time period toward more productive ways, I guess, produce more rice in a given piece of land, and how people at the time employed the new methodologies, mechanisms to raise productivity and so on. And oftentimes I'm so surprised to get to know that students have no idea how rice is produced, what rice plant look like. Oftentimes they say, yes, exactly, rice tree. What is transplantation, 이양법, right, which was adopted in mid-Joseon period, which really revolutionized the productivity. Do you know what transplantation meaning? Gardeners, you should. So.
We've all been scolded. Thank you. Very, very good. We have 3 seconds left, so I think I will let the countdown conclude. The numbers are flashing. This has been a wonderful panel. Thank you all. Let's give an applause. We will reconvene here in 15 minutes for the next panel, The Work of Mountain and Water.